This one was sent to CourtneyDriveThru@gmail.com from Charlie in Starkville, Mississippi.
Oh, it took this long.
Jonathan Coachman recently said Vince McMahon didn't like the fact that he was bigger than him. He said Vince didn't like the backstage interviewers to be bigger guys because it made the talent look smaller. Was this one of Vince's pet peeves when you were with the company?
Well, no, he's just said two different things there. He said Vince McMahon didn't like it because I was bigger than him. And then he said Vince McMahon didn't like it when the backstage interviewer was bigger than the talent. And those are two different things. And I can tell you, yes, Vince was the same way when I was there. And so is pretty much almost every promoter that I've ever worked for, with, or been around is, no, you don't want your interviewer to be bigger than your talent. And I mean, maybe when Jules Strongbow was the matchmaker in Los Angeles, 6'6" and 350 pounds or whatever, he's standing there next to Nick Bockwinkel. Well, you couldn't do that much about that. He was the booker. But under normal circumstances, no, you don't want the interviewers, the announcers, the on-camera talent in that respect to be bigger than the wrestlers. Unless it's, it's a guy and it's the girl wrestler, then that's somewhat natural. But as far as, I don't think, is Coachman trying to flatter himself by saying that he had a better physique than Vince McMahon? Because I think
that's not the way I read it. I think it was just size, just overall bulk.
Is he even bigger than Vince? Coachman?
I don't know.
He does. I mean, he may be tall. He came in after I left. I may have met him one time in all these years. He may be taller, but he ain't jacked up like Vince was. I don't think Vince would sweat Jonathan Coachman. Been on the cover of Muscle and Fitness at 72 years old or whatever. I think Vince would have a hard time being in the business he's in if he didn't want people bigger than him around him. But for a business reason, I understand and feel the same way. Which is another reason why that's another triple whammy on Alex Marvez. He's not only the worst interviewer in the history of television, he's bigger than everybody on the fucking roster. That looks stupid.
Smoky Mountain, who did you have? Brian Matthews?
Brian Matthews.
That big ass head?
Well, yeah, I mean, Brian's head was larger than anybody. Well, no, we had several people do it over a period of time. Phil Rainey, the program director at Fox 43, was the first one because he had been Les Thatcher's partner in Southeastern Wrestling, and the fans in the area knew him. And, he didn't do a real good job, but people knew him, but he could only do it in Knoxville. He wasn't going to travel to other cities. One time we got him to come to Johnson City because that's where we were shooting interviews. He came in, it's like, whoa, what a trip. So, okay. And we found Brian Matthews because his real line of work was for years he was a funeral director, a mortician, but he was on the radio on a very small station in Western Virginia, and he had a good voice. He had a large head, but he wasn't ridiculously tall. He was the same height as most of the guys, or if not shorter. He's my height, and he was a portly fellow, but he didn't look like he was any physical threat. And then we had Chip Kessler, who was a radio personality from the Tri-Cities. He was based out of Johnson City for years and years, and he was older and skinnier, and he was just a regular guy, and he did probably the best job of all of them on local promos. So, yes, I wouldn't have had a guy that was ridiculously larger and as young or jacked up or built doing backstage interviews, because the visual would be jarring.
Were there any interviewers or announcers while you were there that Vince really hated? Because so many people came and went while you were there. Were there any that really ticked off Vince?
Oh God, I'm trying to, not the ones you would have thought. They loved to get the DJs involved, like Todd Pettingill and Sean Mooney. And Vince loved people who looked like they would be newscasters or people on other television programs, even if they didn't know jack shit about the wrestling business. Which is why that Michael Cole always got picked over Kevin Kelly. Kevin Kelly was an experienced wrestling announcer. He'd been a wrestling fan most of his life. He'd done local television in Florida. He comes in and immediately, he's a great wrestling announcer, but he's portly and didn't have a lot of hair. And Michael Cole comes in, has never he's called a dog more recently than he's called a wrestling match. And they had to bring him from scratch, but because he had a legitimate news background and had been I'm not knocking Michael Cole here. I never had a problem with Michael. I liked him, but he was not, especially at the start, nearly as good an announcer as Kevin Kelly was, but he had real television in his background. So Kevin Dunn chose him over Kevin Kelly for all the good assignments because he thought that he looked the part more of an announcer, but plus he didn't have to deal with Kevin being a wrestling fan and having wrestling background. They legitimately, even in those days, in the 90s, experience in wrestling counted against you with Kevin Dunn because he was trying to pull the wool over people's eyes every time that they hired somebody new. And they came in, Kevin Dunn or some of his minions in the studio would give the talk that this isn't wrestling and it's sports entertainment and we don't do wrestling and lie to them. And the people with a wrestling background knew the difference and could see through that and knew that was just Kevin Dunn believed it, but that was just what Vince had people say. And the people who didn't have any wrestling background bought it because they didn't have any other frame of reference. So that's why they always picked for better assignments people with real television experience versus anybody that knew fuck all about wrestling. And yeah, so as far as announcers, Vince particularly didn't like. Was there anybody that was there for a week or two? Because that would, if he didn't particularly like anybody at all, they wouldn't be on the television to begin with.
You remember Stephanie Wyand?
Oh, good God, yes. And she was she with Todd Pettingill on one of those morning shows?
That's right. Well, on WWE TV. I don't know about anything outside of WWE.
No, one of the WWE morning show things that they tried on the weekends or whatever. I think that's what she was on, right? I don't know. Where did she come from? I worked there, and I'm asking you.
I have no idea.
Nobody else did either. There was a lot of people with no wrestling backgrounds. That was also, see, I got there right after the steroid business when they had put in the human resources department to be like a real company, and you had to talk to human resources about things. And they hired that Lisa Wolf, and they hired that Osbear D'Arce, and all these executives to work in the office that didn't come from wrestling backgrounds to prove that they were real companies. And they paid them a fortune, and they didn't do anything constructive, and they were usually a bother to everybody. And then after a couple of years, when the heat had died down, they all disappeared, thankfully.